Right. If you've got your Bibles, go ahead and turn over to Luke chapter 4. And we're going to build now and refine some what we started yesterday. So let me just begin with a little recap to remember what we were doing yesterday. As we read in the opening chapters of Genesis, we saw this kind of twofold picture of what a human person is. Okay? And we saw that at the center is this call to exercise dominion with God, in partnership with God here on earth. Okay? And we talked about that as being the real core of personhood is, well, you could think about this as agency. We have an impulse to make something happen, right? We want the world to be different because we were here. We have a need to shape and to decide on things, right? And that's really the essence of personhood. It's how we image God. He desires that we work with Him in this world so that ideally, if we're exercising agency as an image of God, it means what we're doing is what God is doing. Okay? And so, I mean, you can think of gesturing in front of a mirror, and what does your image do? I've not done that yet, and it gestures differently than I do, right? The motions coincide, right? And I think that's kind of the ideal of what we're looking at here. And so that's Genesis 1. It's this top-down approach that kind of comes at the real core of what humans are. But then you go to Genesis 2, and there's three, that essence kind of gets shone through the prism of everyday life in the body, and three primary tasks are identified as kind of the primary way of exercising agency or dominion. They're called to cultivate or serve in the garden. And so there's a production impulse. They're called to protect it or guard it or pay attention to it. Okay? And so there's this kind of protecting impulse, an impulse to intervene if something's about to go wrong. And then they're given the task of calling. And this has to do with kind of initiating and sustaining relationship. Okay? It includes our speech, but also gestures and all the ways in which we kind of encounter other people. Right? And it turns out that these three are kind of the primary created impulses, how we're put together. And then what we saw in Genesis 3 is how they get kind of twisted in patterned ways. And so we saw that right after sin, there's this kind of mixing of the producing and the communicating impulse and so shame enters in. The way that we are in front of another person suddenly becomes uncomfortable, and we want to cover over. And so they create a work project. They sew fig leaves in order to present themselves differently. Okay? And then God comes to talk with them, and they feel that as a threat, and they hide. Right? And so there's this kind of twisting, smearing together of the communication relation part of us and threat detection. Okay? And then when God talks to them, where are you? And what is it that you've done? We find that they're evasive, and they're trying to off-source all their responsibility on something else. Well, that woman, that snake, right? And so what we see is that their basic impulse, their kind of this basic task of serving, producing, creating value in the world is now being dissipated because they view it somehow as threatening. Okay? And so this is the kind of twist that takes place deep within us as sin comes in. All right? Now, what we're going to do in this session this morning is, with that in the background, what we're going to do is we're going to move all the way forward to Jesus. And it's interesting that both Matthew and Luke, they focus on this season, these 40 days that are there right after Jesus has this kind of calling, this identity confirmed in baptism. You know, you're my son. You know, I'm tickled pink with you, right? And right after that, there's this kind of move out into the wilderness. And there, Jesus goes through some, temptations, tests. Actually, the word behind that, it comes from the same root that we get the word, or the word empiricism and things like that. It just means experience. There are certain experiences he has to go through and kind of sort out who he's going to be, what he's going to do in those moments of test or experience, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to use Luke's version primarily instead of Matthew for two reasons, okay? The first is that for Luke, he inserts this genealogy in between Jesus' baptism and the desert testing, okay? And his genealogy ends, if you just look here, in chapter 3, verse 38, where does it go to? Matthew just traces Jesus back as far as Abram, to Abraham. But Luke goes where? All the way to Adam, right? The son of Adam, son of God, okay? And from there, then, he moves immediately out into the wilderness where he's going to face kind of three tests. And I think this is sort of Luke's way of highlighting that the tests that Jesus is facing correspond, they relate in some way to this threefold pattern of how human beings were created back there, okay? Adam is given these tasks of producing, protecting, and calling into relation, communicating. And now Jesus, he enters, and he's going to face some of the kind of key ways in which these get distorted and marred or damaged. And he's going to reach clarity in order to resist that distortion and to show how this impulse can be made right again. Okay, so I think we kind of see the way forward for redeeming these impulses after they're, we come twisted, and Jesus comes and says, let me show you how to do this to get untwisted. Okay? Now, the next thing that, the other reason I'm going to use Luke's version is because the last two are in a different order in Matthew, and this actually follows the order that's there in that we noticed in Genesis 2. And so we're going to work with this one. Now, before we read this kind of piece by piece and talk through it, I want to point out something about how to read this. So the tempter is going to come to Jesus and say, hey, since you're the Son of God, you could translate it if, that's how it's translated often, but it's not a counterfactual or a questioning thing. You could also translate it as since you are, okay? So he's like, I'm not arguing with you as to whether or not, you are God's agent in this world, and Son of God kind of has this sense of being the one who acts on God's behalf, right? He's like, I'm not arguing about that. Okay, you got the call, you're Son of God, you're Messiah, you're here to, to reign. Let's talk about how you do that, okay? And so what he does here is he's introducing perversions of dominion. Okay? Perversions of ways of reigning. And remember, we're all, Jesus is, the paradigm, but we're all created for dominion. Okay? And so I think that's one of the reasons why it comes back to these three impulses. And in each of these things that the tempter proposes, it's important to keep in mind that what we're dealing with here is actually working at the level of intention. It's not just, as it were, the bare deed, the mechanics of the action that's the problem in any of these cases. And in one or two, it'll be real clear because later Jesus does something much like it, okay? But for different intentions, right? And so what's going on here is Jesus sorting out how he's going to exercise dominion, how he's going to reign, and that how has everything to do with the why or the for the sake of. In other words, what is his goal? What is his intention in doing this? It's not just the mechanics of the action, it's the focus, okay, on the inside, right? So let's go ahead and start here with the first one. And we'll see how this kind of a typical perversion of this producing impulse. And somebody read for us then Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Nice and loud.
And Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days. And when they were ended, he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone."
Thank you. All right. So we've said that this production impulse is essentially given to us so that we would be motivated and find ourselves creating value in this world that God made. And so the way that I define this work or production is it's the creation of value by applying the energies of our mind and body to available resources. Okay? And what happens here is that there's a kind of twisting where instead of producing for the sake of God and God's world, where it's just about the value that's being put out there, this gets kind of twisted inward, and this production impulse turns into a kind of obsession with self-soothing, self-satisfaction. I'm gonna use the word craving, okay, to describe that. But it's a sense that my work in the world, it's okay if God gets something out of it. It's all right if it benefits my neighbor, but it's really got to, pad my account first, right? It really has to meet my needs before anything else. And it's that kind of flip in terms of who I am doing something for and how I go about it that makes it all come apart, okay? Now, and so the distortion here is to make it primarily about me. And this craving, the term that you have in the New Testament fairly often is this, the Greek word is epithemia, right? Which has to do with, we translate it lust often. In some contexts in the Bible, it's translated as coveting. But it's the sense of I'm driven by desire for what I can get out of this, right? So there's this kind of move towards what's going to feel good, what's going to satisfy me. Now, the deep order in how God put the world together is such that we thrive by work that we do for the sake of God and others. and it's really kind of paradoxical, but we're put together in such a way that actually we only do well when our focus in the work is on something other than us. Okay? And when we twist that back and we start making our work about us before it is about God and God's world and others that are in need and things like that, then it starts to kind of lose its meaning and it twists us. Okay, and so what the devil says is essentially this: it's like, okay, you're God's agent and you're going to reign and all of that, and you can take care of the others, right? But let's start by filling your own belly. Okay, I mean, if you don't take care of you, who's going to do it, right? And so you take care of you, and then later you'll be able to take care of other people, right? Now, that really sounds to me fairly reasonable, right? In fact, it's possible that I've even given that kind of advice on occasion, right? It's a kind of a feature of, as it were, human-centered wisdom, okay? But when that becomes kind of the primary thing going on, everything else kind of comes apart. And so what Jesus does is he sees that this kind of move of using his capacities primarily to soothe himself rather than kind of keeping it focused on God and his world, that would prevent him from really producing all that God intends for him to produce in this world. Okay? It becomes a limiting factor when the first thing is I have to be satisfied in whatever it is I'm doing. Right? And so what Jesus does is he kind of counters this suggestion to twist his production impulse by recalling the words of Moses with regard to the manna in the wilderness. Okay, so towards the front end of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, Moses reminds them, he says, the Lord led you all these years through the wilderness, and he fed you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, so that he might kind of examine you, test you, and find out what's in your heart, and so that you may learn, and this is now what Jesus cites here, the part that we are to learn, the lesson out of manna, and it's simply this: humanity isn't designed to live by what fills its belly alone. Okay, by bread alone. Manna, it had some kind of unusual behavior, unusual properties. Right? You read through it and it had this way of kind of appearing and sticking around for different lengths of time depending on what God's purposes were. Okay? So you go out and you pick it up, as it were, Monday through Thursday, and if you pick up extra, it's bad. It rots. And they're told, just pick up for one day. But then on the day of preparation on Friday, they're to pick up for 2 days because there's not going to be any on Sabbath. And on that day, it actually will last now for 2 days. And though it's shown up on 6 days, it's not there if you go out to look for it on the Sabbath. Okay, it doesn't behave in just like a mechanical fashion. Right? It's variable what it presents depending on kind of what God's project demands. Okay, and the reason for that, this you see this in some of the kind of Second Temple wisdom literature also, this observation. The reason the manna behaves so oddly is that it's actually a pedagogical device. It's a teaching element that the Lord gives so that his people can learn how to live in this ongoing dependence on him and his project. That it's a process of learning that we will be taken care of as we engage in God's project in that moment, at that place and time where God's project is happening. But if we step outside of that, our efforts at production, our efforts at self-sustaining become futile, right? And that's why manna is so strange. It's not like an ordinary sort of substance in the way that it behaves, the way it's presented, because it's in order to show us that this is that our sustenance comes ultimately from the Lord, not through kind of the mediary things that He provides. Now, this temptation then of turn stone to bread that Jesus rejects, I said that this is about intention, not the action. And let me just point out here, I don't see, if you look at it just at the level of the mechanics of an action, how turning stone to bread is that much different from taking a few loaves and making it into a whole lot of bread, right? Or a few fish and turning it into meals for thousands, right? It's still kind of the creation, the production of edibles in a way that's quite miraculous, okay? I don't think that the primary problem here is that it's stone. I think the point of this is that it works at the level of intention. You see, when Jesus uses His powers to produce for the for thousands on the side of the hill, what is the intention there? Okay? He's doing it now, and it's quite clear in those cases, it's out of compassion, right? He's doing it for the sake of the people there. Now, presumably, Jesus eats also along with the thousands, okay? There's nothing wrong in our production also benefiting us. It just that if we make that our intention, it twists it, okay? And we find that we've kind of maybe satisfied ourselves for a moment, but we've then neglected others, and in the long term, we're not even taken care of well ourselves, okay? And so getting the intention correct means moving back to this is for God and for others, okay? So far, so good? Yeah? All right. The second distortion that Jesus faces is with this protecting, preserving impulse. So somebody read for us chapter 4, verses 5 through 8.
And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time, and said to him, to you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours. And Jesus answered him, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve.
Thank you. The perversion that takes place in many is to move from protecting to domineering. Okay? It's kind of like at some point, we figure out that, or we start to imagine that the best defense is a good offense, right? That just kind of controlling, making everybody do what I want, making sure that I'm on the top of the heap, that's the best protection. Okay? And that twists this impulse that we were given that goes quite deep. I mean, I think behind this is just this protecting and preserving or maintaining. It has all of those senses. God created us to live in a world marked by the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, things don't stay put. Things that we produce or put in order tend to fall apart over time if more energy isn't invested. If somebody doesn't take out the trash, it overflows, right? If we, don't change the oil on time, the car breaks down, etc., right? And within that, one of the things that we have to protect against are, as it were, threats when somebody would seek to do wrong against another. Right? And so we have this impulse to stand up in between and to intervene. And my sense is that what Jesus is facing here is a distortion in which that stand up, intervene impulse kind of becomes hair triggered, right? Where we get to be hyper vigilant. Like to have a protection impulse means I'm paying attention, but there's also a way in which I can focus too much on looking for threats, right? In which I start to see kind of threats everywhere. And the result of that then can be this kind of, blustering and domineering posture. And it's important I chose domineering here as a word on purpose. It sounds like, but it's not the same thing as dominion, right? So we're created for dominion, which is this kind of responsibility for, the world under God. But domineering is something where, I have a deep need to control and maybe just push around people. And maybe here, maybe it's rooted in some kind of underlying sense of fear or inadequacy, right? I mentioned this, we live in a world where things fall apart. If we're working with God, if we have this kind of partnership with the Lord, this co-dominion, then there's resources when we need them that come from beyond us. But when we're on our own, it gets frightening out there, right? And so Jesus' insight here, so the tempter's suggestion is, align with me and I'll put you over all of it. You'll be able to control the nations, domineer, have an iron rule, right? And all you have to do is fall down and worship. Okay? And part of what I think is going on here in Jesus' response, his insight, is that the only way to exercise this protection impulse well, to have our stand-up impulse calibrated right, is to first decide that the one and only one before whom we will bow down, who we will fall down before, is God. Okay? And that resolving, knowing that I will always fall down, I am already surrendered before the Father, paradoxically gives me the capacity to stand up well at the right moments in the right ways. Okay? And so this need to fall down before someone in order to be able to stand up and to resist and intervene and protect, it's actually structural. Like it's built into the way we're put together as human beings. It turns out that it's impossible to exercise our will over time consistently without just kind of wearing out, getting tired. There's a lot of work over the last, 10, 15 years on willpower, actually. And the way in which it requires energy, like even caloric energy, right? In order to be sustained. And it's interesting that there's just this kind of threshold of fatigue beyond which I can't manage to make a choice, right? Decisions kind of cost something in terms of energy. Exercising my will takes energy. And so standing up to take care of something or to protect someone, standing against a resistance is a strong exercise of will. It takes all kinds of energy, and because of that, you can only do it so long, and then you're going to kind of wear out. There's one exception, actually, though. There's one type of choice that you can make all day long without wearing out. You can surrender. And this is something that even like psychologists are noting. For instance, the capacity for sustained effort in change in people who are breaking free of addictions, what they found is there's programs that kind of, if you think of things like AA and Narcotics Anonymous and stuff like this, there's programs that have wanted to remove I surrender myself to the higher power, right? And there are statistically, not just significant, but very obvious loss of effectiveness in those groups that don't use this, I surrender to a higher power, okay? And psychologists will, if you catch them in an honest moment, they'll say, well, we all know that the single most effective way to break an addiction is for that to happen in the context of a religious conversion, okay, when you're surrendering to something. They just say, we don't talk about it because we don't know how to do that, okay? And so it turns out that the human will was really designed for surrender or for this kind of synergy where I'm now working in something where the larger project is coming from God, right? And that's why we can't stand well without falling down before the Father. But the flip side is this: when I fall down before the Father, when I'm rooted in this surrender, I now can stand against anything. Okay, one is never so strong as when one dies to self. We're never as powerful at the level of will as when we're surrendered to the Father. Okay, and so we see Jesus kind of making this choice here for the first time, but he returns to it. Remember, right at the end in the Garden of Gethsemane, he comes back to this point of surrender to then be able to stand against another temptation, right? Which also would have been a distortion of this in that circumstance, right? And so he says, Father, if you will, take it away, but not my will, but yours. And in that surrender, he has the power to walk into that, okay? And to stand against evil and give himself. Okay. The twisting of this calling, communicating impulse into manipulation. Chapter 4, verses 9 through 13. Somebody read real loud for us.
Then the devil took him to Jerusalem to the highest point of the temple and said, "If you are the Son of God, jump off. For the scriptures say, he will order his angels to protect and guard you, and they will hold you up with their hands so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." Jesus responded, "The scriptures also say, you must not test the Lord your God."
Okay.
When the devil had finished tempting Jesus, he left him until the next opportunity came.
Thank you. Okay. So this impulse to communicate, establish relationship, maintain it through interacting. It only works rightly within this kind of shared context where we're both going to tell the truth and we're sharing this project, right? And what happens is that gets twisted, and in its place, there's this kind of manipulation that becomes the norm in human communication, where I start using language for how I can get you to do what I think I want done, regardless of whether it's true, regardless of whether or not it's for the good of God's project. And this also turns into a kind of a twisting of our way of communicating with God. When we turn Godward, manipulation doesn't go away when there's this kink in our system, right? Instead, what happens is that often manipulation in religious settings or toward God becomes something like religious spectacle. And so what the tempter's saying is, okay, God's made some promises, and he said that you won't be able to strike your foot against a stone. Let's go to the temple, throw yourself off, and of course everybody will see it, right? He'll have to act. He'll have to show up because, you have it in the fine print, right? And Jesus' response is interesting. He goes back, he quotes from this passage that's remembering the testing that takes place initially in Exodus chapter 17. That passage at Massa, right, in chapter 17 is where it's one of the places where they're hungry. And so what they do is they start grumbling and kind of causing problems for Moses, right? They come against Moses because of this. And what we see here is that that testing is something like maneuvering or trying to leverage in order to get something done, something from God. And the alternative then, would be something like just a frank, clear, plain asking from God, like coming to God and saying, as far as I can tell, this is what's going on, and I think it ought to be this way. Would you please? Okay, and so there's this kind of alternative of trying to leverage and manipulate and force God to do something versus coming and just asking in a straightforward way. And it's interesting here that essentially Jesus' choice is for a simplicity and kind of frank honesty in how we go about talking to God. And if you just think then about Jesus' teachings on prayer that follow a little later, it develops this, right? So thinking now of Matthew 6, but Jesus, remember, he says, when you pray, don't do it like the pagans. And essentially what he's saying is the pagans, they use rhetoric, right? And he says you don't need to use all your rhetorical skills, as it were, to try to manipulate God into giving you something or flatter him into giving you something, right? What you need to know as you interact with God is that you can't flatter him into getting what you want. But you also need to know you would never need to, because he's the Father that already cares for you, wants what's good for you, and wants to supply what is good, right? And that's why instead of kind of manipulative displays, what we can do is we can just come in very simple ways and say, Father, would you please? Okay? And so this is what we see Jesus facing. And in each case, there's this process of bringing the basic impulse that we were created for back into alignment, focusing on what's good for God, for God's project, for those in the world that I'm caring for, and allowing care for myself to come as a byproduct of that rather than coming before it. Okay? And so this is how Jesus gives us a model, I think, for the redemption of these three impulses that we were created with. All right? We stop there. Question, comment? I know we started a few minutes after, so I don't know if we